You're listening to the free ad-sponsored re-release of American Election's Wicked Game, a weekly march through every presidential election from 1789 to 2024. To listen to all episodes right now ad-free, go to intohistory.com. Subscribers there enjoy ad-free listening, early access, bonus content, and more from a growing collection of great history podcasts. Start your free trial today at intohistory.com. A listener note. This episode quotes historical records containing racially offensive language. It's the morning of September 6, 1872, at a local sheriff's office in Buffalo, New York. Sheriff Grover Cleveland sits at his desk in silence. His mood is somber. He's been dreading this day for months. Back in June, a man named Patrick Morrissey murdered his own mother, Ann Morrissey, in Buffalo. In July, Morrissey was found guilty and sentenced to death, and as sheriff of Erie County, it's Cleveland's responsibility to carry out the sentence. A knock at the door breaks the silence. "Excuse me, may I come in?" "Of course, Deputy." It's Deputy Richard Harris, Cleveland's subordinate. He stumbles into the room, looking a worried mess. "Were you able to sleep, Sheriff?" "Hardly. Me neither. And I couldn't eat a thing, but I did manage a few glasses of brandy." "Sir?" As Cleveland turns to the deputy, he pauses for a moment. The deputy pulls out a small bottle of brandy as he struggles for the words. I'd like to volunteer to take your place." "No, that wouldn't be proper." "It's more than proper, Sheriff. The law says you can appoint a surrogate for a $10 fine." "It's out of the question." "The job's up to me, Mr. Sheriff. I can do something like this without it haunting me the rest of my days. You can't, so I won't take no for an answer." Cleveland sighs. Deep down, he wishes he could take Harris up on his offer. But the responsibility is his. His mind is made up. He's determined to see it through. Cleveland stands, looks Harris squarely in the eyes. "No, I have to do it myself. I am the sheriff." Harris nods in understanding. He offers Cleveland a drink, but Cleveland doesn't take the bottle. "No, thank you. I need to be clear and sharp, and I don't want this to be a public spectacle." "Well, there's already a crowd gathering outside, Sheriff." "How many?" "Quite a few. We'll send them home." "They've already assembled, sir." "Then order the men to clear the square by force." "Yes, Mr. Sheriff." At 11:43 a.m., Grover Cleveland leads Patrick Morrissey to the gallows in a courtyard of the jail. A small crowd of invited witnesses gather around as the priest says a prayer. As the noose is fixed on Morrissey's neck and his head is covered, Cleveland takes his place at the base of the gallows. He grips the lever of the trapdoor. The priest opens a piece of paper and reads Morrissey's last words. "I'm ready to go now. Goodbye. God bless you all." Grover Cleveland pulls the lever. The trap springs, and Patrick Morrissey's body falls. As his neck snaps, many in the crowd gasp and look away, but Cleveland does not. He ordered his men to construct the gallows in such a way that he would have no choice but to look. His eyes remain fixed on Morrissey's body, dangling, twitching towards death. Wicked Game is sponsored by Factor. You know that nursery rhyme, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old? Well, the first thing you need to know is that peas porridge was a real thing. Second, it's spelled P-E-A-S-E, a Middle English plural noun like flour, but made from legumes like peas. Third, it was the ultimate in medieval convenience food. Boil up anything you had in a single pot until you get a viscous slime, eat what you can stand, then just keep eating. Hot or cold, throwing in more stuff as you go. 9 days old may not be an exaggeration. So convenient, but not tasty, and maybe even rancid. These days, we are so much better off with Factor. Same convenience, much more taste, and a lot less gross. Factor is America's #1 ready-to-eat meal kit. Chef-prepared, dietitian-approved, ready-to-eat meals delivered straight to your door with over 35 different options a week to choose from, including keto, calorie smart, vegan, veggie, and more. And there's even more to enjoy with 55 nutrition-packed add-ons that help make your weekly meal planning even more delicious and certainly better than throwing whatever you can scrounge into a pot. Head to factormeals.com/wickedgame50 and use code wickedgame50 to get 50% off. That's code wickedgame50 at factormeals.com/wickedgame50 to get 50% off. Wicked Game is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you do if you had an extra hour in your day? It could come at any time, in the morning, midday, in the evening. You could sleep in. You could actually take a lunch. You could go on an evening walk. I'd like to say I'd take a nap or read a book, but knowing me, I'd probably end up working because there's always work to do, right? A lot of us wish we had more time. But time for what? Do you know what's important to you? How to make it a priority? Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. And as the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. And if things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. It couldn't be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/elections today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/elections. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Elections Wicked Game. During his time as sheriff of Erie County, Grover Cleveland earned a reputation as an honest man who never shied away from his responsibility. That reputation earned him a nickname, the Buffalo Hangman. Not once but twice, Sheriff Cleveland was forced to administer the death penalty. And both times, though deeply conflicted, he insisted he be the one to carry out the extreme sentence. Cleveland's reputation as a tough but dutiful public servant propelled him to an illustrious career in politics. First as sheriff of Erie County, then mayor of Buffalo, then governor of New York, and finally the 22nd president of the United States. As president, Cleveland would again take a tough stand on a difficult issue that would become the centerpiece of his re-election campaign, the tariff. Cleveland advocated for lower tariffs. He and most Democrats believed that these lower tariffs would protect American industry by opening up American goods to an international market. But Cleveland's almost singular focus on the tariff would leave many with the impression that he was out of touch with American voters. And it would also leave open the door for a Republican candidate to fill the void and challenge Cleveland's stance on the tariff issue. In 1888, Republicans would nominate Benjamin Harrison, grandson of President William Henry Harrison, as their candidate. Harrison and the Republicans advocated for protectionism, the view that higher tariffs on imports bolstered American industry and protected the American worker. In the 1888 contest, Cleveland and Harrison would fight it out over this tariff question in a contentious campaign defined by partisan rancor, political scandal, and in the modern parlance, fake news. This is episode 26, 1888, Cleveland versus Harrison, Tariffs and Truths. It's 7:30 p.m. on May 4th, 1886 in Chicago, Illinois. A light rain falls on the crowd of 2,000 McCormick Reaper plant workers gathered at Haymarket Square. For the past 3 days, these workers have joined forces with thousands of laborers throughout Chicago, demanding a shorter workday and higher wages. Yesterday, the peaceful protests turned violent. Police fired into a crowd of striking workers outside the McCormick factory. Several men were wounded, 2 men died. Tonight, they gather again to protest police brutality. Pro-labor Chicago Mayor Carter Harrison is the first speaker. My fellow laborers, let us continue to strive for acceptable working conditions for all. Mayor Harrison's attendance here is little more than a political maneuver to curry favor with the labor vote, and many in the crowd know it. As he leaves the rally, the mayor has a quick conversation with the police captain, John Bonfield. Captain, how many men do you have here tonight? Nearly 200. I'll make sure this meeting of anarchists ends peacefully. The meeting will end soon enough on account of the rain. Just send your men home. But the police captain does not follow the mayor's instructions. He saw the flyers advertising tonight's rally, reading, "Attention workingmen, mass meeting tonight. Speakers will denounce the latest atrocious acts of the police, the shooting of our fellow workmen yesterday afternoon." So Captain Bonfield plans to keep his entire force on hand until this meeting ends or he brings it to an end. As the evening wears on, the crowd thins. By 10 o'clock, only 200 men remain to hear labor activist Samuel Fielden speak. Fielden roars to the crowd. "For years, we have labored in poor conditions. We ask only the companies follow the law, shorten the hours, increase the pay. Since 1867, our federal government has dictated that the laborer shall work no more than 8 hours per day. But is that how many hours you are forced to work? I've heard that many employers won't hire a man until he signs a waiver of the law. We call for this corrupt practice to end." Though much smaller than it was earlier in the evening, the crowd is getting worked up. They chant 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. But the workers protesting aren't the only ones being riled up. As Samuel Fielden wraps up his speech, he notices about 175 policemen gathering at the back of the crowd. Captain Bonfield forces his way forward to the makeshift stage. "Disperse! This meeting's gone on long enough. I know you intend to throttle the police, and I won't have it." Fielden attempts to defuse the situation. No, this is a peaceful demonstration." But the captain isn't taking no for an answer. So Fielden relents. He turns to step off the stage. And just then, a pipe bomb exploded, sending out a large burst of fire and shrapnel enveloping the crowd. Instantly, nearly 100 were wounded. 8 policemen and 4 laborers were dead. Though they didn't know if a protester had thrown the bomb, police opened fire into the crowd. Within minutes, dozens of activists lay dead or wounded. Police searched for the bomber but never found him, nor learned a motive for the bombing. Nonetheless, police arrested 8 labor rights leaders. The men, including Samuel Fielden, were charged with murder. All 8 were convicted and sentenced to death. Public opinion was divided. Many felt that the trial of these men was pure partisanship, an anti-labor spectacle and a miscarriage of justice. Others felt that the so-called anarchists had gotten what they deserved. President Grover Cleveland, though, offered no comment on the trial or the demands of the growing labor movement. The Haymarket Affair, as it would come to be called, was just the beginning of the sometimes violent struggle for labor rights. In the run-up to the 1888 election, social unrest would be rampant. In the country's hour of crisis, President Cleveland would, by and large, look the other way. In doing so, he would jeopardize the safety of the citizenry and damage his prospects for a second term. The Haymarket Affair was not an anomaly. In the 1880s, the fight between big business and labor was contentious and often violent. An influx of immigration only contributed to American workers' economic anxieties and deep-rooted fears that they were being marginalized and displaced. In 1886, the number of labor strikes doubled the previous record. Across the U.S., coal miners, factory workers, and rail workers demanded safer working conditions and higher pay to match rising corporate profits. But it wasn't just the laborers in the cities and on the railroads that had issues. In the 1880s, the United States faced significant economic and social issues across the board. For farmers, U.S. monetary policy stood out foremost. In the past decade, the United States had gotten on the international gold standard, a set exchange rate between gold and international currencies. This strengthened the U.S. dollar around the world, and bankers and most politicians liked the system. However, a minority of members of both parties, called inflationists or bimetallists, advocated for using gold and silver to back printed money. These inflationists argued that bimetallism would help farmers and other laborers have access to more credit. These groups had struggled to repay debts under the gold standard, which limited the amount of cash in circulation because dollars were backed only by gold and there was only so much gold in the treasury. Adding silver to the mix would put more money in circulation and therefore loosen up more for lending. Cleveland's own vice president, Thomas Hendricks, had been one of the champions of bimetallism and advocated for increased coinage of silver. However, after Hendricks' untimely death, Cleveland largely ignored the silver issue. Across his presidency, Cleveland proved to be a hands-off leader. He thought he should only intervene on matters which affected the entire nation. Cleveland viewed the president as a referee between disparate groups of Americans, not a champion of any specific issue or side. When Texas farmers were nearly wiped out by a severe drought, Cleveland vetoed an aid bill. He explained, "I do not believe that the power and duty of the general government ought to be extended to the relief of individual suffering, which is in no manner properly related to the public service or benefit. Though the people support the government should not support the people." Cleveland applied this principle to social issues as well. In the spring of 1886, 10,000 railroad workers, members of the Knights of Labor Union, walked off the job. They left nearly 6,000 miles of track unattended. Produce rotted on train cars, grain mills shut down for want of wheat, and thousands of Americans lost their supply and travel lines. The strike also soon turned deadly. Governors in 4 states called on police to protect rail lines and get the trains moving again. At least 10 people died in altercations between police and rail workers in Fort Worth, Texas, and St. Louis, Missouri. Cleveland acted as a mediator and worked to bring about an end to the strike, but he did not take a stand for or against labor. Instead, he focused almost entirely on a separate political issue, tariffs. It might be said that Cleveland believed lowering tariffs was a cure for all the nation's many woes. He certainly believed that a lower tariff would protect American workers while lowering the prices of manufactured goods. And so, despite growing unrest across the nation, President Cleveland made the tariff his top priority. Many Democrats worried that Cleveland's determined stance on this issue would weaken his upcoming re-election campaign, and many Republicans thought they were right. While the president had a singular focus on the fight for lower tariffs, Republicans worked behind the scenes to use Cleveland's tunnel vision to their advantage. It might be said that President Cleveland's decision to focus on lower tariffs took the fight to the Republicans' political arena. For years, Republicans had tried to use the tariff issue as a point of contrast between their party and the Democrats. Democrats like Cleveland wanted to lower tariffs and open up American goods to foreign markets. Republicans advocated for protectionism, the practice of shielding the country's industries from foreign competition by taxing imports. For Republicans, the tariff was a fight many wanted, and a fight they believed they could win. As one congressman put it, "The Democratic Party has come out in the open field where we can get a whack at them." But before the Republicans could get a whack at Grover Cleveland, they needed to settle on a candidate, and the party was still divided into 2 primary factions, the stalwarts and the half-breeds. The stalwarts were largely pro-business and pro-federal patronage, a process where supporters of a candidate were rewarded with posts and perks in exchange for their support. The half-breeds were largely pro-reform. They wanted to get rid of federal patronage in favor of a merit-based system where the most qualified person got the job. To bring these 2 disparate groups together, the Republicans needed a distinguished leader with pedigree and a strong national reputation. They would find their man in Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison, America's 9th president. He was a gifted public speaker and lawyer, an astute political mind, a war hero, and most importantly, a devout protectionist. Harrison saw the tariff issue as a way to curry favor with the American worker. He said that while establishing tariffs, the wages of American workmen should be carefully and kindly considered. The free trader is for a cheaper coat, an English coat, and he does not seem to care that this involves a cheapening of the men and women who spin and weave and cut and stitch in America. But at the Republican convention in Chicago in the summer of 1888, Harrison was not the frontrunner by any means. The Republican Party boasted a crowded field of potential candidates, like former Speaker of the House James Blaine, former President pro tempore of the Senate John Sherman, and former Michigan Governor Russell Alger. So at the outset of the convention, Harrison, the one-term senator from Indiana, was an afterthought. But his words at the convention helped catapult him from long shot to big shot. He took on Cleveland's tariff position, arguing against what he called the paralyzing shadow of free trade. He largely avoided the controversial issue of federal patronage and instead united the party around 2 issues, the tariff and protecting black rights. Harrison reminded the Republicans that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were collectively designed to free the slaves and guarantee citizenship to black Americans, were the true legacy of the Republican Party. The legacy of the Democrats was rebellion, sectional strife, and oppression. They were the party of the Old South. Republicans were the party of the future. Thanks in part to his eloquent speeches, Harrison won the Republican nomination on the 8th ballot. Levi Morton, a former congressman and wealthy banker, was selected as his running mate. And the platform that the Republicans adopted was a clear signal that the party was united around Harrison and protective tariffs. It read, "We are uncompromisingly in favor of the American system of protection. We protest against its destruction as proposed by the president and his party." After the convention, the New York Tribune stated, "The voters need to know what the tariff means, what it does for them, and what a Democratic victory would involve. This year, the Republican Party needs to depend upon facts and reasons. There must be argument at the beginning, argument in the middle, and argument to the end of the campaign." So on the campaign trail, Republicans would try their best to draw a contrast between Harrison and Cleveland, but not just over the issue of tariffs. They also pointed to issues of character and patriotism. Harrison had served in the Army during the Civil War and helped to put down the rebellion. Cleveland had paid a substitute to take his place. The contrast between the two candidates was also evident in their campaign styles. Cleveland would not openly campaign, abiding by the political norms of the day and leaving his advocacy to his friends and supporters. Harrison, by contrast, would launch an aggressive front porch campaign, making a bevy of speeches in front of thousands of Americans who flocked to his home in Indianapolis to hear his gospel of protectionism. Still, the 1888 contest would largely be fought not on the stump, but in black and white. Both parties would use the press to push dubious narratives about the opposition candidate. Both parties would resort to dirty tricks, and both candidates would find themselves on the receiving end of an October surprise. The war in the press would bring to bear the question of tariffs. It would draw a line in the sand between the two candidates and define the final weeks of the campaign. In the end, the fight would center around a single and seemingly bizarre issue: fish. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War through the war itself and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. If you're a careful Wicked Game listener, you know in the credits I mentioned my friend Professor Greg Jackson and his podcast, History That Doesn't Suck. It's a great show. But one way it can doesn't suck even more is when you listen to it without ads. You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game, all episodes of History That Doesn't Suck, and all episodes of many more great history podcasts without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. History That Doesn't Suck is a deeply researched chronological survey of American history from a trained academic who also knows how to tell a story. Plus, in addition to ad-free listening to one of the best American history podcasts out there, you get scores of bonus episodes at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. It's October 11th, 1886, in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, Canada. An American fishing vessel called the Marion Grimes sits moored at the Shelburne docks under the guard of Canadian Captain Quigley and his men. 3 days ago, the American vessel got slapped with a $400 fine for failing to promptly pay a customs fee. Though the American consulate paid the fine, the Marion Grimes still hasn't been released by Canadian authorities. Marion Grimes' captain, Alexander Landry, and his sailors are getting restless. All right, gents, let's have a little fun today. Bring me the flag. That ought to get old Quigley going. I certainly hope so. Captain Landry and his sailors hoist the American flag, letting the stars and stripes wave in the wind. Canadian Captain Quigley, sitting on the dock nearby, notices and calls to them. "I order you to strike your colors. You are under the dominion of Canada's power and will not display your flag in such a manner." Captain Landry knew that Quigley would react exactly this way, but he wants to nettle the Canadian, who has been a thorn in his side for 3 days. Landry had sheltered his vessel in Shelburne Harbor for 12 hours, waiting out a storm. For this harmless act, Quigley had fined him and seized his fishing boat, refusing to let Landry and his crew get back to deep-sea fishing in international waters. The American sailors snigger as Quigley gets red in the face, but they comply and lower the flag. An hour later, though, Captain Landry allows his sailors to raise the American flag again. Quigley hails from the dock again.
"I ordered you to strike your colors."
The Americans laugh. They are tired of Quigley's pompous attitude, but Quigley has had enough. He shouts to his men to grab their rifles. Armed Canadians board the Marion Grimes. Quigley himself boards and looks deadly serious. "For the last time, lower your flag." The laughter is gone. Captain Landry is no longer smiling, but he is also resolute. "No, you have no reason to keep our ship any longer. Take your aim, men." Quigley's men point their weapons at the Americans. The unarmed sailors back up. Quigley moves forward and lowers the flag himself. As he leaves the vessel, the Canadian captain makes one last remark. "You will not fly this flag. You will stay in my power until I say otherwise." Landry and his crew are furious, but there's nothing they can do. Quigley disembarks the Marion Grimes with their flag in hand. The next day, the American consulate finally gets the ship released, but it's too late to save their fishing season. Captain Landry's bait has spoiled. He and his crew return to Boston empty-handed. But in the aftermath of the incident, President Cleveland sees a political opportunity to shore up support for his presidency and win voters to his side in the always essential electoral state of New York. In 1886, U.S. fishermen did not technically have the right to fish in Canadian coastal waters. In 1871, the two countries had drawn up a treaty that allowed Canadian and U.S. fishermen to fish in one another's water and sell their goods in any port for a fee. By the mid-1880s, Americans had grown tired of paying Canada a premium for fishing privileges, and so Congress withdrew from the treaty, creating confusion and fueling animosity between Canadian officials and American fishermen. Canadian custom houses started charging exorbitant fees and seizing U.S. vessels like Captain Landry's Marion Grimes. And after dozens of American ships received similar treatment, Congress intervened. In March 1887, they passed a Retaliation Act. This gave the president power to bar Canadian fishing vessels and any Canadian products from entering U.S. ports. Cleveland had the good sense not to use this power against one of his biggest trade partners. He asked his Secretary of State to take care of the fishing rights issue, who immediately began negotiating a new treaty with British Foreign Minister Chamberlain, who controlled Canadian foreign affairs. But dealing with any Briton was politically dangerous. By the mid-1880s, anti-British sentiment ran high in the U.S. Grover Cleveland's position on lower tariffs was considered by many to be a boon to British manufacturers. Canada was also largely seen as a mere extension of the British Empire. This anti-British sentiment was especially strong among Irish Americans in a key electoral state that would likely decide the 1888 contest, New York. So to appease Irish voters, Cleveland needed a treaty that favored America's interests over the interests of Canada. His Secretary of State delivered. The Bayard-Chamberlain Treaty of 1888 accommodated American fishermen and ensured that no more American vessels would be detained. It went to the Senate for approval in February 1888. But Senate Republicans saw a chance to undermine the president's anti-British stance and weaken his image with Irish voters in an election year. One senator told a British envoy that he would reject the treaty no matter its terms. "We cannot allow the Democrats to take credit for settling so important a dispute." But President Cleveland and Navy Secretary William Whitney expected this from Senate Republicans. In August 1888, Whitney told a political ally, "I want Cleveland to take the aggressive on the fishing question, and after they reject the treaty, retaliate." As suspected, on August 21st, Senate Republicans voted the treaty down 27-30. For these Republicans, the vote was less a principled stance and more a piece of political calculus. Republicans hoped to put Cleveland in the position of defending the treaty his administration had negotiated. Regardless of the terms, the treaty was fundamentally a deal with the British, and Republicans wanted to cast Cleveland as the pro-British candidate, a president who put foreign powers' interests ahead of America's. But Cleveland did more than defend the treaty. 2 days after the vote, he caught the Republicans off guard. Cleveland sent a message to Congress. He denounced Canadian treatment of American sailors. He then asked Congress to give him retaliatory powers against Canada and lambasted Republican senators for rejecting the treaty without attempt to amend it. The message was crafted to earn political points for Cleveland because he already had retaliatory powers against Canada, and he knew that the treaty was a good deal for America and guaranteed American fishing rights. Cleveland's message to the Senate simply ensured that anti-British voters would see him take a strong stand against British interests. The White House went one step further. They leaked Cleveland's message to the press and ensured that favorable statements from Irish political leaders ran next to the text. Former Irish League President James Mooney predicted Cleveland's measures would have a good effect among all friends of Ireland and haters of England. And in the days and weeks after the message leaked, hundreds of letters of support from Irish families came flooding into Washington. Through deft maneuvering, Cleveland had wrong-footed Republicans, and he had begun his re-election campaign on very solid ground. Harrison's Republican campaign of 1888 looked different from the previous election in one key way. Harrison's front porch campaign had him giving countless speeches from his own front porch in Indianapolis. Campaign managers hoped to avoid a fiasco like the 1884 Rum, Romanism, and Rebellion speech, where an unscripted speaker had insulted voters and embarrassed Republican candidate James Blaine. They would not allow that to happen to Harrison. He himself explained, "There is a great risk of meeting a fool at home, but the candidate who travels cannot escape him." So Republicans invited delegates, special interest groups, and supporters from all over the nation to Harrison's front porch. When crowds grew too large to stand on his lawn or street, Harrison moved to a nearby park with a stage and ample seating. He delivered over 80 speeches and always managed to work in his support of a high tariff. Harrison was considered a cold, aloof man, attributes that earned him the nickname the human iceberg, but his front porch speeches helped to soften his image and make him seem approachable. When he spoke to the Terre Haute Railroad Club, Harrison promised to promote safe conditions for rail workers and enact federal laws to guide labor disputes. He argued that a protectionist tariff benefited the railroads that do the transportation, the working men who find steady employment at good wages, and the farmers who supply their needs. Harrison's eloquent speeches brought in droves of supporters, but Republicans needed to do more to unseat the incumbent president. They needed something to weaken their opponent. They needed an October surprise. Mere weeks before the election, a Republican leaked a letter from a British native and naturalized American named Charles F. Murchison to Sir Lionel Sackville West, the British ambassador to the U.S. In the letter, Murchison asked the British ambassador which presidential candidate was best for Great Britain. Murchison explained that he was personally inclined towards Cleveland, whom he called favorable and friendly to British interests. Murchison also wrote that Cleveland was, for British natives, the one above all Americans they consider their own and their country's best friend. But Murchison was concerned about one thing, Cleveland's aggressive stance towards Canada. He wrote that if Cleveland intends to cease his policy when his re-election is secured in November and again favor England's interest, then I should have no further doubts but go ahead and vote for him. I apply to you privately and confidentially for information. Such information, if favorable to Mr. Cleveland, would enable me to assure many of our countrymen that they would do England service by voting for Cleveland. British Ambassador Sackville West responded to the letter, claiming that Cleveland was absolutely Great Britain's man. He wrote, "You are probably aware that any political party that openly favored the mother country at the present moment would lose popularity, and that the party in power is fully aware of this fact." The ambassador explained that Cleveland would have to downplay his pro-British sensibility on the campaign trail, but once elected, he would return to a spirit of conciliation towards the British. Newspapers across the country published the letters. Irate Irish Americans in New York stopped campaigning for Cleveland. One Republican campaign leader wrote to Harrison, "The Sackville letter is having a wonderful effect on the Irish here and proves more at the dash of a sentence than we could by argument during the whole campaign." Cleveland was shocked. He couldn't believe that Sackville would do such a stupid thing as vouch for the president's political intentions in a letter with a stranger. A week after the letter appeared, Cleveland fired Sackville West. But the damage had been done. Republicans distributed thousands of copies of the letter at an Irish protectionist tariff rally in New York City. They claimed it was proof that Cleveland was in the pocket of the British. But it wasn't proof of anything. Mr. Murchison, the British native and naturalized American who wrote the letter, was not British at all. He was an American, a Republican from California, a political operative named George Osgoodby. Acting on his own, Osgoodby had written to Sackville West. When the ambassador had responded, Osgoodby published the letters. He hoped that Sackville West's promise that Cleveland would return to a pro-British stance would offend Irish voters, and it did. All of the political points that Cleveland had garnered through the American fishing rights crisis seemed to be melting away. Things got worse for Cleveland when in early October, evidence surfaced suggesting Democrats in New York were actively buying votes for Cleveland. Desperate to find a scandal of equal proportions, Cleveland's campaign would lash out, accusing Republicans of buying votes in New York for Harrison. In the end, the Democrats' attempt to fight fire with fire would backfire. Cleveland's popularity would be severely weakened, and the Harrison campaign would seize the opportunity. Icebergs, jagged rocks and rocky straits, mutinies, misfortune, and broadside battles. There are more tales of the sea than survivors to tell them, but the podcast Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is doing a good job, and you can listen to all episodes of that podcast plus many others, including American Elections Wicked Game, without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is one of my favorites from last year, a podcast about the greatest mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures of the sea. You'll hear stories of corruption, greed, bad intentions, and just plain horrible decision-making that resulted in some of the worst maritime disasters from all over the world. And some of these are more recent than you think. All episodes are ad-free, including bonus content and more at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. It's Wednesday, October 31st, 1888 in New York City. A reporter for the New York Evening Post walks to the hotel room of Colonel William Dudley. Dudley is the Republican National Committee treasurer and a personal friend of presidential candidate Harrison. The reporter holds a copy of a letter recently printed in the Indianapolis Sentinel. The letter gives instructions on how Republican campaigners should go about buying votes in Indiana. The newspaper attributes the letter to Dudley. The reporter wants to get Dudley's side of the story. Excuse me, do I have the pleasure of speaking with Colonel Dudley? What do you want? The reporter shows Dudley the printed letter. Sir, did you send out the circular? Dudley doesn't even glance at the letter. He knows what it is. He knows what it says. The circular as published is a forgery. Did you send a circular substantially the same as this? I won't answer. I will only say that this letter, as published, is a forgery. Sir, are you aware that the Democratic National Committee Chairman Calvin Bryce claims this letter and your signature upon it are genuine? Dudley sighs. He was not aware of that. But it doesn't change the facts of the case. A few weeks ago, a similar letter from a Democratic campaign organizer authorizing Democrats to buy votes was leaked to the press. From Dudley's point of view, it's apparent why Chairman Bryce would claim that his party is innocent and the Republicans are actually the villainous vote buyers. Dudley answers the reporter's questions carefully. I will say only this. The letter is a base forgery. They attribute to me words that I never used. I propose to prosecute every paper that has published this alleged letter. What inaccuracies do you notice in the letter? He looks over the letter and responds. There are many. The entire letter is distorted and mutilated, and forgeries appear everywhere. I have no time now to stop and point them out. Well, sir, a satisfactory way of settling the matter may be publishing the original letter. The Evening Post would print it forthwith. But Dudley looks appalled at this suggestion. I'm not going to give away my case before trial, but I say for the last time, this entire letter is a most deliberate forgery. Every paper that should print it will be prosecuted for libel. Dudley slams the door, and the reporter walks away. He didn't get much, but he got enough for an update in tomorrow's paper. The Dudley letter was found by a Democratic mail clerk. Curious about the large number of letters coming into Indiana from Republican Party headquarters, the clerk read one. He realized it held an answer to the vote-buying accusations being thrown at Democrats. The clerk sent the damning letter to the Indiana Democratic State Central Committee, and they published it. Dudley publicly disavowed the letter's contents. He sued the paper that first printed it. But his friend and candidate Harrison stayed silent. Dudley's circular went public on Wednesday, October 31st, 1888, only 6 days before the election. It was the scandal Cleveland needed to pull attention away from the damaging Osgoodby letter. But it also had an adverse effect. The scandal highlighted that Democrats had also been accused of vote buying. On October 8th, the Indianapolis Journal had published a letter from a Democratic county chairman instructing his precinct workers on how to buy votes. It read in part, "Mark every voter who has to have money as a float. Look closely after every one. Let no one escape." Dudley's letter to Republican county chairman had the same tone. "Put a trusted man with necessary funds to make him responsible that all vote our ticket. There will be no doubts of you receiving the necessary funds through the national, state, and county committees. Only see that it is made to produce results." Both parties faced public scrutiny, but most of it fell on Dudley. He was on the National Republican Committee. The scandal had the potential to hurt Harrison all across the country, and especially in New York. The Empire State was Cleveland's home, and Democrats worked tirelessly to maintain his base there. The Dudley letter was strong ammunition against Harrison, and the Democrats did their best to use it to shore up support for Cleveland. And while Republicans hoped to steal Cleveland's home state away from him, they faced an uphill battle. Cleveland had strengthened his public image by marrying 2 years prior to the election. One newspaper editor quipped, "It will be much harder to win against both Mr. and Mrs. Cleveland, because Democratic campaigners knew how to use Frances Cleveland's public appeal. Campaign posters featured her husband, his running mate, and her." But Cleveland's image wasn't bulletproof. The Sackville letter hurt his chances. So too did his strong stance on a lower tariff. And when party leaders asked him to soften his rhetoric, Cleveland responded, "What is the use of being elected or re-elected unless you stand for something?" On Tuesday, November 6, 1888, voters went to the polls in droves. Anxious vote buyers went with them. Both Democratic and Republican precinct workers had cash on hand to sway undecided voters. One party worker said his political counterparts had lots of $2 bills, and so did we. But these methods did not have much effect. Since both parties attempted to buy off undecided voters, it might be said that their efforts canceled each other out, and the Dudley letter had election workers on high alert. New York City Chief Federal Election Supervisor John Davenport hired hundreds of temporary poll workers to watch for and prevent fraud. One historian has noted that as a result of the Dudley letter, the election of 1888 was the cleanest in years. The Osgoodby and Dudley scandals rocked the final leg of the campaign, but the largest scandal on Election Day 1888 received little, if any, press coverage. Black voter intimidation ran rampant as suppression of black votes continued in the South. Along with Jim Crow laws, unfair and confusing rules at polling places discouraged black voters. And while outright violence was rare in 1888, white election officials certainly knew how to keep black voters away from the polls using fear and intimidation. And of course, if any blacks did manage to vote, polling officials could make their ballots disappear. As one Mississippi Democrat declared, "The niggers can vote if they want to, but we count the votes. And you can just bet your bottom dollar that the white men are going to stay on top." Late on November 6, Cleveland sat in the White House as election results poured in from all over the country. As expected, Cleveland won the solid South. He also took Connecticut and New Jersey, but only by a thin margin. Harrison won his home state of Indiana, but the real linchpin was again New York. Many Irish voters abandoned Cleveland, believing him to be in the pocket of the British. As a result, Cleveland lost his home state by a mere 14,000 votes. By midnight, the president knew it was over. Harrison won the presidency with 233 electoral votes to Cleveland's 168. In retrospect, Cleveland realized he could have softened his tone on the tariff issue, but that would have gone against his principles. The lame duck president told a friend, Perhaps I made a mistake from the party standpoint, but damn it, I was right. Cleveland publicly admitted defeat on November 7th. When asked to explain his loss, he wryly said, "It was mainly because the other party had the most votes." But it wasn't. Cleveland won the popular vote, garnering 100,000 more votes than Harrison. But Harrison won New York and Indiana, critical states that gave him a majority in the Electoral College. It was the third election in American history in which the victor did not win the popular vote. As Benjamin Harrison prepared to reinstate the Republican Party in the White House, the Republican-leaning press could not have been happier. On November 8, 1888, the pro-Republican New York Tribune declared, "Let us also be thankful that under the rule of the Grand Old Party, these United States will resume the onward and upward march." The Republican Party nickname, Grand Old Party, had been used sporadically for a few years, but with this article celebrating Harrison's election, it became official. After the election of 1888, the Republican Party had a new moniker, the GOP. While Harrison geared up for his first term, the young Cleveland family prepared to retreat into civilian life. Frances Cleveland had thrived as First Lady, and she felt the loss deeply, but she felt something else too, a desire to return to the fold. In March 1889, Frances Cleveland told a White House steward, "I want you to take good care of all the furniture and ornaments in the house, for we want to find everything just as it is now when we come back again." The baffled servant asked what she meant, and Frances Cleveland added, "We are coming back just 4 years from today." In the election of 1892, Grover Cleveland would again run for re-election. Cleveland would seek to make history, hoping to become the only Democrat to win his party's nomination in 3 separate presidential elections and the first president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. But to win back the White House, Cleveland would have to contend with more than just President Harrison and the Republicans. He would also have to get the best of a burgeoning third party movement known as the Populist Party. This radical faction, largely made up of farmers, would challenge the status quo, garner an impressive chunk of the popular vote, and threaten to make America's third two-party system a 3-way race. This is episode 26 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1888, Tariffs and Truths. On the next episode, the election of 1892, Benjamin Harrison, the centennial president, survives a deadly strike, an international conflict, and the massacre at Wounded Knee. But during his campaign for re-election, the death of a loved one threatens to deprive Harrison of a second term. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details. And while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Sound designed by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by C.L. Salazar. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
What would you do to achieve the American dream? The big house, the happy family, the money.
911, what's your emergency?
Would you put in the hours? Would you take a big swing?
What's the problem? What's the problem?
Would you lie? Would you cheat?
Would I shop? Would I shop?
Would you kill?
Yes. My mom is dead. My mom is right there.
From Airship, the studio behind American Scandal, comes a new true crime history podcast. I'm Jeremy Schwartz. and I'll be taking you inside the minds of some of our most notorious felons and outlaws, exploring the dark side of the American dream. In my new show, American Criminal, you'll meet the picture-perfect brothers who'd kill their parents, the thief who stole babies, the crypto king who siphoned off billions, and plenty more. From assassins and gangsters to killers and con artists. Whatever the case, whoever the criminal, you don't know the full story. Until now. Don't miss the debut season of American Criminal, The Menendez Brothers, beginning February 29th. Listen wherever you get your podcasts, or to get early ad-free access to the entire season first, plus hundreds of other ad-free history podcast episodes, subscribe at intohistory.com.